Welcome to Maine Voices livestream. Before we begin, some messages from our sponsors. Stroudwater Lodge is an independent and assisted living community located just minutes from downtown Portland. Residents love the spirit of the lodge, enjoying the privacy of their own apartment and all the benefits of a full-service community with easy access to fabulous dining, entertainment, and shopping. Stroudwater Lodge is just a stone's throw from their sister community, Avita of Stroudwater, which focuses on memory care.
When you're out in the wild, or you're on the water, or you're looking at an island that was formed hundreds of thousands of years ago, you realize that we're only here for a flash of time. And you also learn, the older you get, if you're lucky enough to get old, is that it starts to accelerate really fast. We've had the privilege of working with some families for over 5 generations. So we know when someone is trying to make a decision about who to trust their legacy with, that it's one of the biggest decisions that they'll ever confront. We are disciplined investors and strategic family trust planners. We've managed wealth for generations, and we are grateful for the trust families have given us. This is patience. This is discipline. This is trust. This is H.M. Payson.
Hi, good evening, and welcome to Maine Voices Live. Thank you for joining us. I write about the arts for the Portland Press Herald and Maine Sunday Telegram, and tonight I have the pleasure of introducing an art-focused conversation between the newspaper's art critic and the chief curator of the Portland Museum of Art. And tonight, we will hear about the visual arts in a conversation with Shalini Le Gall, Portland Museum of Art's chief curator, and the Susan Donnell and Harry W. Conkle Curator of European Art. At the PMA, Le Gall oversees exhibitions and acquisitions, and this year contributed to the installation of the exhibition David Driscoll, Icons of Nature and History, which attracted quite a bit of national attention. She has been in her role for about a year, and prior to coming to the PMA, she worked at the Colby College Museum of Art, where she co-curated the exhibition Inside Out, The Prince of Mary Cassatt, on view now. Leading tonight's conversation is Jorge Arango, who has been writing about art, design, and architecture for almost 40 years and has been reviewing the visual arts for the Press Herald for about a year. I've enjoyed Jorge's reviews very much and appreciate his clear and concise observations. This coming Sunday, he'll be writing about the art of Michael Droge on view at the Maine Jewish Museum. And in addition to writing for the Press Herald, he has co-authored a dozen books on interior design for various publishers and is working on a monograph for Rizzoli on the work of interior architect and designer Orlando Diaz Azcoy. Jorge, the platform is yours, and enjoy the conversation.
Thanks, Bob. Hi, Shalini. Nice to see you.
Hello, Jorge. Wonderful to see you as well.
Thanks. So why don't we just start off by just talking a little bit about what your new position is going to be, like how it's different from what you were doing at the museum before, other than everything probably being ramped up 20 times and over. So why don't you just give us an idea?
Sure. Thank you, Jorge. I wanted to first thank you and the Portland Press Herald for inviting me to come this evening. And thank everyone out there listening. I'm really grateful for the time that you're spending to join our conversation about the arts, about Maine and the arts, and kind of just thinking broadly about culture in this digital age. So I joined the Portland Museum of Art just before the pandemic in February 2020, and I came into the position of Chief Curator about a year ago, so about last September. And in this role, I have the great honor to work with a fabulous team to oversee acquisitions, the exhibition program, determine collection priorities, thinking about care for the collection. So it's really this multifaceted role that just depends on the teamwork of the museum.
Great, thanks. So it's a critical time for a lot of museums. As we were talking before, there was an interesting series of articles in the Times about what museums need to be today to respond to their communities and so on and survive. So I just want to read a little bit of a quote as a lead into the next question. It's from one of these articles that is by Tess Thackara, from the Times, who says that it's an existential moment for museums across America. For some directors of small and mid-sized museums, the events of the last 12 months have given fresh urgency to their outreach initiatives, particularly to Black communities, and their efforts to make their collections relevant to a restless and reform-minded younger generation. So this is what they're saying is the direction that we need to go in. However, the PMA appears to me to have kind of been on the forefront of that already with the Art for All program that you've been doing, with the exhibit Freedom of Fable that brought in contemporary views to art that was of another era. The same thing with the Homer Remington show. So can you talk a little bit about, in your new position, how you want to reach out to the communities and connect with other audiences that don't traditionally go to museums?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jorge. And it has been such an interesting time for museums, as they have been kind of just these cultural institutions that have had to adapt to this shifting landscape. And so it's interesting that a series that the Times runs gets such kind of nationwide currency, because it's really just such of our moment. But as you described, there are some museums who had been doing this work and had been thinking in this way prior to 2020. And I think the PMA was certainly among those museums. Art for All, as it's really kind of structured and conceived at the museum, really kind of emerged out of the Your Museum Reimagined campaign that some of our listeners may remember from several years ago, when the museum really realized that it needed to invest and focus in a deep, kind of profound way in thinking about diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusivity, or DEAI, as these initiatives are sometimes referred to. So Art for All is really kind of at the core of our mission and our vision, and we try to think of it as this kind of all-encompassing umbrella that guides our work, but that also kind of orients and focuses our tasks. So what does it mean to think about opening the museum doors to populations who maybe have not felt comfortable or welcome in museums up to that point? How do you help visitors who maybe feel barriers to entering the museum? How do you help them cross that threshold? And that thinking and that work is not one person's work, right? That is work that is shared across facilities. It is shared across communications and marketing. It is shared across learning and interpretation, philanthropy, curatorial. It's everybody's work. And so Art for All is really kind of this term that focuses us and that guides us and that builds community investment in that mission of the museum. So I think the PMA was really poised to kind of really to transition in this difficult time, because the kind of foundation had already been laid for this. As you described, Freedom of Fable, which was an exhibition that the museum mounted late last summer into the fall, and then through the spring, was really a very kind of nimble curatorial response to the murder of George Floyd, and to ask ourselves, what does it mean to think about Blackness in America today? What does it mean to think about Black bodies in America today? How do we put artists in conversation with each other, historical and contemporary? What does Kara Walker, for example, have to say to the works of Winslow Homer? How does Daniel Minter kind of enter into this conversation? So I think, for the curatorial team, it's a really amazing opportunity to kind of draw from the collection. All of those works were already in the museum collection, and then to work with our community members. We had community voices that really guided the interpretation of that exhibition. So,
Right.
yeah, sorry.
No, that's right. No, that's great. So one other thing I think is along these same lines. So that was a nimble sort of thing that you did, which was easy because probably it's a smaller mid-sized museum, right? Larger museums can't do that. And also some exhibitions are in development for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? So by the time you get to whatever issue it is, it's hard to kind of turn on a dime and make those more relevant to what's happening in contemporary society. But you did that with the myth makers, the Homer and Remington exhibit. So I'd love you to just, for people who don't know this, just to talk about the advisory councils you put together to bring new perspectives to this art of another time.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, one that is really core to the way that the PMA thinks about its relationship with its communities and its interpretation program. You know, there are, I think, many museums in the United States that are still oriented in a way that kind of the museum knows all, or there's a kind of single nameless voice that interprets the works of art in an exhibition. And the PMA just, it doesn't really run like that. So it's been years that for many exhibitions, we'll have these advisory councils, these community advisory groups that are formed months, sometimes a full year prior to an exhibition. And we bring these folks into the conversation about the exhibition. We invite them to write labels that will go up onto the walls. We invite them to contribute audio programming that may be featured kind of with your phone, or you can kind of access it online. But bringing the community into the process of the presentation and the interpretation of the works of art had already been core to the Portland Museum of Art. It's one of the reasons why I found it a really fascinating place to work, because there weren't a lot of museums that were doing that. And now it's quite timely. Now it's quite of the moment to do that. But I think we're fortunate in that we have the structure in place.
Right. So I also find, I mean, I'd love you to talk about your own background too, and how it plays into this whole outreach effort. I mean, one of the things that you will be doing is academic outreach. So I'm interested to know from your perspective, growing up, I mean, you ended up specializing in 18th and 19th century French and English art, correct? Right. So that's kind of an interesting trajectory. You want to talk about how that happened?
Yeah, how much time do you have?
Well, can you give us a highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really surprising turn of events, right? And I think, Jorge, when you and I spoke a little bit earlier, you know, I shared with you that I didn't necessarily even know what art history was growing up. I certainly didn't think it could be a field or a career path, and I kind of stumbled into it quite late in my undergraduate career. And as I started thinking a little bit about why certain art got collected in museums, where kind of the big global museums were, you know, there are particular moments that I remember. For example, visiting London and seeing museums that were filled with material culture objects, devotional objects, even from South Asia, from India, which is the area that my parents immigrated from to this country. You know, those are pretty transformational moments, and they impact the way that you think about museums and you think about power dynamics in museums. But I think I decided to enter the field because I didn't want the conversation to stop there. I didn't want to just kind of, you know, leave museums in this kind of static, kind of dead space, right? And they're not. They're really active, vibrant centers for our communities, and they're active, vibrant centers for contemporary artists. And so we need to be a place of conversation. We need to be a place of dialogue. And so although my background and my early experiences really kind of informed my education and informed my practice, and certainly drew my interest into 18th and 19th century European art, I mean, the age of empire, kind of the conquest, colonization of the world. I'm interested in that for really specific personal reasons, certainly, but I also recognize academically how they shape our world today, and how they continue to kind of reinforce these structures of power that we're still trying to battle, that we're still trying to break down and expose. And I want to be part of that work, but I want to do it with our communities, with our visitors. It's shared work for all of us.
Well, so you mentioned the power element there. And so museums have a lot of power. They determine what is collected, what gets an imprimatur of a museum. You know, it's a tremendously influential force, or can be and has been historically. So when you think of that, what sorts of things, if you can give us any kind of preview of what you're working on for the future, come from a different perspective, not that usual that usual sort of white, male dominated perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we think about kind of structural dynamics that maybe have reinforced patterns of thinking about kind of what a museum represents, what a museum in Maine maybe represents. One of the exhibitions that we have up right now is thinking really deeply about climate and about kind of the museum and the state of Maine's interest and efforts to become a more sustainable environment, right? So Clifford Ross Sightlines is an exhibition that looks at photography and nature and kind of coastal landscapes. But as you walk through those spaces and you think more about kind of the practice of photography, what he's doing in capturing those images, how they're attracting our interest in the surface and the tactility and the texture of the printed surface, you start to realize and reflect on kind of really the materiality of our natural environment. And that kind of is just reinforced. So, there's ways in which exhibitions that maybe even don't seem like perhaps they're so directly connected to the subject of climate change or social justice or whatever it might be, those threads are really there. And moving into next year, we'll be looking really closely at Maine's role in the North Atlantic. So one of the exhibitions that will open next year will consider Maine in this kind of larger North Atlantic framework that will include Iceland and Sweden and bring together a range of artists, contemporary, from the entire North Atlantic region. And it will be a really interesting venue for Maine artists to be able to kind of appear on this kind of larger global stage, but also for those of us in Maine to understand how our state is part of a dynamic that is international, maybe in a way that we don't necessarily always think about, right? I think I spoke to you, Jorge, about thinking about Maine not as this kind of extreme northeast end of the United States, but as actually a southern state, right? If you're looking at this larger North Atlantic kind of framework. So how does art help us shift our perspective, shift our point of view? I think the PMA is going to do that in the months and years to come. And it will happen through exhibitions. It will happen through broadening our collection practices and thinking about what does it mean to broaden an installation or an exhibition of American art? How do we become more inclusive in our presentation of American art? And part of that will involve thinking about Maine's indigenous communities, right? How does Wabanaki art and how does the work of living Wabanaki artists enter our collection, enter our museum? How do we make space for those discussions in our galleries?
Right. I'm also curious about how you balance things because, we can go completely in that direction and then ignore some very important art. So I'm interested to know, does the 18th and 19th century European art have something to teach us today? Like, does it speak to relevant issues of our day? And how do you integrate that into this more inclusive view that you're taking now?
Yeah, so I think 18th and 19th century art and even art much, of an older period is continues to be relevant. Some of my most favorite objects in the museum are really works of art that the works of art that you linger in front of because they speak to you, they force you to pause, they force you to kind of think more deeply, are really a lot of the 19th century works of art. And that's because you think about them and you see them and you understand them in domestic spaces. You understand the history of Portland, you understand the history of Maine. You start thinking about landscape and environment. So for example, Charles Codman, who's a landscape painter in Maine in the early part of the 19th century, those paintings draw you in and they pull you in because we're familiar with this area. We're familiar with that environment and that landscape. And I think we might it might be tempting to look back at historical art and think, okay, this is not relevant because this is not of our time, right? But the art that's being made today will one day be historical, right? And this art is also still relevant and will continue to be. So I think part of the interest for me in looking at historical art is understanding, okay, why was this relevant in its own time? What did this mean to people then? How did they understand it? And maybe how was their understanding shaped by other things, whether that was concerns about industrialization, right? That's something that's really of interest to us now because the industrial age in the 19th century we know now is the kind of beginning of this process of kind of climate disaster that we're in. So, we can look back and we can look at those paintings and think about those railroads, for example, in Monet's paintings, the steam coming off of those train engines, and for them it was wonder, but it was curiosity and also a little bit of suspicion in understanding kind of how is this man-made mechanically created steam integrating with the kind of airy atmosphere above. So, folks back then were just as curious and wondered in just the same ways that we do. And I think, I'm enough of a historian that I do think back at kind of why those things were important in those times and what they can teach us today, because there are lessons there to be learned.
Right. I think of the futurists too in Italy, where it was all about speed and locomotion and movement forward, and it was not looking back at all, and there were consequences to that way of thinking, right? That we're feeling today. So it'd be interesting to see how those two viewpoints mix or relate to each other in a contemporary way. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And speaking of the futurists, you look at the early 20th century, the machine age, right? And the way that kind of the machine aesthetic came to really start to inform kind of abstraction in the early part of the 20th century. And again, how something that in some ways was maybe idealized at one point in time, we've started to see 100 years later what the effect of that could be. And, we think back on that.
Right. So this also leads to another conversation you and I started at the Driscoll show, which was taking a contemporary point of view. And I was asking you whether it was relevant to start with a contemporary issue and then look for the art that relates to it in a way, to assemble an exhibition according to the issue of the time as a way of making it relevant. Your answer to that was great. And I loved it, and I still have questions about it. But what you said, your answer first was the academic answer to that would be is that you lead with the art. You always lead with the art. And then later we talked, and you said your hesitation about it, which I loved, was that art is created amidst many contexts, right? So sort of picking one context to relate to in a particular painting kind of denies all of those other things that were happening that led to the creation of that art. So which I think is really wonderful. I really appreciate that point of view. I'm wondering though, whether there is value in looking, and in a way, I think that's kind of what you're doing with this North America or the North Atlantic thing, or with 2020, Untitled 2020, right? You were sort of starting with the art because you were asking artists what they were thinking of, right? And what they were doing during this year of 2020 that was so difficult for so many of us. And it happened to touch on every issue, right? The contemporary dystopia, the pandemic, like all of these things. So I'm just wondering if there's any validity in starting that way, from that point of view, from what is happening now, in terms of informing the curation.
It's a really interesting discussion. And I think any curator will tell you when they're planning a show, there's always this tug, there's this push and pull between the works of art that are really compelling and the kind of overarching framework or theme that you need to hold a show together. And I think, when you and I spoke, we were within the David Driscoll Icons of Nature and History exhibition, right? And what a great exhibition to be in when we're having this discussion, because we sit and we kind of, we're looking around and we're surrounded by these incredible works of art by David Driscoll, and, an amazing African-American painter who's long established in Maine and passed away last year. It was a very emotional conversation, kind of in that space. We were masked. We hadn't had a lot of in-person conversations at that point, and I think as we surrounded ourselves and kind of looked, you could see that David's art, it ranged from landscape, it ranged to religious icons. There were works that were just really clearly about civil rights, right? But in some ways, all of those works were also about all of those things, right? It's not as if you could take 6 works and pull one theme out of them. And so I think when we think about, when we think about the idea or the art, the reason that I think my instinct, and I think most curators' instincts, would be lead with the art, start with the art. It's because you don't want to foreclose any interpretation of a work of art. I never want to kind of prevent someone from having a really unmediated experience with an object or with a work that they find in a museum. And I think that just stems from an acknowledgement that there are so many different kinds of visitors. There are so many communities in Portland and in Maine. There's not just one community. And every one of those folks, I can't even imagine what the range of those responses will be like to a work of art. So, when you enter an exhibition and you see a show, you see a show that's been guided and that's been crafted by a lot of people putting ideas together and putting objects together. But that is not the only way that those works can be interpreted, or those works can be internalized even, right? So this is why I always say lead with the art, because that's, I think, when the artist is making the work of art, historical or contemporary, that's what they want. That's what they want. They want that engagement with the viewer. Right.
Thank you. So I'm also interested in the historical piece. So the PMA has historical holdings, and is part of what you'll be doing, scholarship being one of the main functions of museums as well, research and scholarship. Trying to find new ways to look at those old collections?
Yeah, I think there are always multiple ways to look at a collection, but I think if we can take an example of someone really iconic to the state of Maine, to the PMA, Winslow Homer, for example, right? And you're in the museum and you're thinking about Homer, you're thinking about the coast, you're thinking about weather beaten, this iconic painting of the collection, and then you're surrounded in that space by scenes of the Maine coast. Right. And I think we tend to think about those as scenes that are maybe nostalgic, maybe idyllic, maybe peaceful, maybe relaxing. But I think, we can also look at those scenes and think about them as scenes of the Atlantic, as scenes of the ocean, and thinking about fishing and thinking about the lobster industry, thinking about all of these other things that also happen in those spaces. So I think one of the things that we're thinking about as a kind of broader museum team is how do we bring those questions and those concerns that, yes, they're guided by our contemporary interests, but they were also happening back then. How do we bring that into the interpretation of the museum so that when people are walking through, they're also thinking about those things, that these spaces are active, these spaces are worked, these spaces mean lots of different things to lots of different people living along those areas.
Well, and I also just think of, I remember an essay that Peter Sheldall wrote years and years and years ago called Notes on Beauty. And he was basically saying there's a lot of value in just plain beauty, just being able to come up to a painting and get lost in it. And he had this beautiful phrase in there where he said, it's like, the rock and the river, that it should sort of stop you and make you go, ah, and then the water continues, but it continues in along a different course. It's something has changed in you. So is that still valid nowadays, that point of view?
I think it's absolutely still valid. And I think that's, what I was trying to allude to earlier, and that you don't want to foreclose the possibility that someone will have that really kind of strong, visceral reaction to a work of art. One of the works of art at the museum that really just kind of stops me in my tracks every time is this tall, full-length portrait by James McNeill Whistler. And it's essentially a black and gray full-length portrait of a female figure. And the black and gray are so hazy and kind of intermixed that you get up close and you're not entirely sure what you're looking at. Where does the figure begin and the background end? You can't kind of see those borders. So it's a painting that stops me because it's haunting, but it's also about painting. It's about paint. It's about color or the absence of it. It's about figuration and abstraction, but I'm not thinking all of these things when I stop in front of the picture. I just know in that moment, wow, this painting painting makes me stop and want to look and want to engage. And of course, we want visitors to have that experience in the museum. I think the interesting thing for me always, when we walk through, any of us, I think in the museum when we walk through, it's always so interesting to see which works stop visitors, because you can't predict what will speak to an individual.
Right. So are there historical shows coming up? Are there some being planned that you can tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the coming years, we'll start to look a little bit back at historical European art and thinking about kind of the 20th century. In particular, we're reaching the 100-year anniversary of the Surrealist movement. So that will likely be the focus of some of our programming kind of moving forward. And, you know, as I mentioned, I think we're thinking kind of just more broadly about our presentation of our historical collections. How do we do that in a way that is broader? How do we do that in a way that invites more voices in to be part of the interpretive program? So a lot of our attention will also be focused there.
That's great. And also I love the North Atlantic idea, because it's not just a museum bringing things in and presenting them, it's also the museum reaching out into an international sphere that it probably has not been part of before, right? So it's not just about what comes in, it's about what you're originating there and sending out into the world.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it seems like an interesting idea for us now, but it's an idea that's also just always been part of Maine. When we think about Maine's role in shipbuilding and in maritime traffic, you know, Maine has really for centuries been a connector out into the world. So in some ways, kind of thinking about the North Atlantic Triennial as this kind of return to something that's actually quite intrinsic and quite core to our state is really exciting and kind of fulfilling, I think, for all of us. You know, in thinking about kind of upcoming exhibition programs, there's also ways in which photography has become really an important part and an important presence for our museum. So I think as we move forward, thinking about kind of photography, new media, how does the museum become an active place for the presentation and the discussion of these collections? And then also for kind of looking at relationships between historical art and contemporary art, between American art and European art. Where are those links? Where are those bridges? And how do we bring them to the viewers and invite them into that conversation?
That's great. So we have some questions coming in, and before I go to those, I just wanted to ask, is there something that we have not touched upon here that you are really passionate about, that you want, some sort of message you want to get through about where the PMA is today and where it's going?
You know, there are so many things I am passionate about when it comes to art and when it comes to the museum. But I think I would just like to take a moment to thank the community for their support of the museum in this really difficult time. It has meant a lot. Those of you who I've seen come into the galleries, come into the museums, who have responded, who have sent us feedback, you know, any form of engagement, attending our digital programs, our virtual programs, all of that is really meaningful to all of us in the museum. You know, I think we're all firmly committed to art. We love living in Maine and we love working in Maine, because Maine is a place that cares about art, where culture in that form is important, and where contemporary artists breathe life into that practice. So I think my only word is to say just thank you for all of your support.
Are there more, will everything be online, just since you're talking about that going forth?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one for the field. I'd be interested to know how all of you at the Press Herald are thinking about these questions as well. I think there have been things that have been really successful and positive with the Zoom format, with the online format, as I saw here, like people logging in from all over the country. It's really just wonderful. But then there's things that are also limiting, right? Kind of that absence of human contact. And I think particularly in the museum, as we talk to people in in the galleries, they're excited to be there in person. They're excited to have a moment with their friends and their families, and in kind of experience that kind of the humanity of that space in a way that the digital realm can't replicate. So I think we will start to see some type of hybrid, maybe, that where certain programs are offered one way and others in different ways. But I'm not sure. Have you all started talking about that as well?
I don't know, because I freelance for the paper, so I don't know, but I know from my own experience on Title 2020, it was very, I think the technology needs more refining, because it was hard to zoom in on specific works. And then there was one work I remember that was like 8, sort of a narrative book, right, that was in 8 parts. And it was kind of impossible to get the camera to go where I wanted so I could read each part and get the full impact. I saw it later and realized I had not gotten the full impact of it. So
yeah, I mean, I think the virtual tours, they have been extremely popular. I have loved going on virtual tours for exhibitions that I'll never get to, probably, but they're not a substitute, right? They're not a substitute for the in-person experience, and also because it just really denies the kind of physicality and the corporal experience that being in a museum really provides, right? And we start to realize, oh, that's actually a lot of what happens in that space. But our digital programming, the ways in which we've been able to take our interpretive programming online, to give people previews via virtual tours, that has been incredibly rich and incredibly helpful, especially for folks who maybe are not living in Portland. So the reach we've been able to have has been really incredible.
Right. Yeah, I think for me, it matters. As a reviewer, it matters most in something very tactile like painting. You cannot see impasto and you can't see brush stroke and things like that, and online it's just impossible, really. So yeah, I encourage everyone to go into the museums. I mean, that's the object of the reviewing. I don't really review things I don't think have merit, because my desire is to demystify art and get people in just to experience it in all its realms and all its contexts. So so I hope everyone goes. So why don't we check some questions? Here's one from John Shipman. I'm intrigued by the street art graffiti in Portland, including but also beyond Ryan Adams. Has the museum considered an inside exhibit of Portland street artists?
Oh, that is a great question. I agree. It's been a really interesting development in the Portland art community. And I think, one of the things that's really struck me about our interest in that area is if you think about the fact that a lot of us just kind of uncovered that area of particularly Portland's artistic kind of scene during the pandemic, when many of us were kind of closed up at home. It is a really interesting kind of space. So there's a part of me that says that kind of art absolutely has a home and has a place in a museum. But then I also recognize that the meaning and the value of what those artists are doing is very public facing and is very accessible in a way that a museum cannot always provide. So I'm going to have to think a little bit more about it, but I really appreciate the question, because I do think there's a place for that. And Ryan Adams was an artist that was part of the Untitled 2020 show.
Right. So here is a question from Barbara Epstein. I'm a retired secondary teacher who continues to substitute. I brought students to the PMA. I am saddened to know how many students have never visited the PMA. What plans do you have to bring our students to the PMA? If our students are not familiar with the fundamentals of art, they cannot make connections to history and literature.
That is a wonderful question. And it's true that with the pandemic, that has not been a program that we've been able to run as actively as we had in the past. So we did transition to some remote and online work that we were able to do with PMA. It's called PMA Classroom, which provided a portal of entry into schools and into teachers who wanted to use that platform. But I do really appreciate that question, because one of the most transformative experiences for me was going, and I was a high school junior the first time I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that was a really just kind of profound and changing experience, because as you described, Barbara, it opens up a whole new world that you don't always know existed.
Great. Here's a question from John Bechard. Shalini, given your recent background, have you contemplated developing a relationship with Colby whereby it would be possible to show parts of Colby's wonderful collection at the PMA?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, because I think one of the things that a lot of us that work in the museums in Maine really appreciate is this spirit of generosity that the museums have with each other. So we often lend to the exhibitions. We had works by David Driscoll that are in the Colby Museum's collection, the Lunder collection there, were on view at the PMA for that exhibition this summer. And we have lent to them as well in the past. So I am very familiar with that collection at Colby, and I know that we will have future opportunities for sharing these collections and for lending back and forth. It is really one of the wonderful things about being in Maine is the collegiality of the arts institutions in this state.
Great. So someone picked up on your Whistler reference. Greg Garrick says, speaking of Whistler, one of my favorite paintings is his view of London Bridge at night, which hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There was a similar painting by Whistler in a recent exhibit at the Colby College Museum. Whistler had guts painting unusual views where black and gray are the dominant colors. Any chance a future exhibit at the PMA could delve further into works by artists who painted in dark monochromatic themes?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. I think when we think about kind of someone like Whistler and just how unusual and bold he was to be doing that in the 19th century, really taking his figurative compositions to a place that was almost abstract by historical standards. And we think about that now. It's almost a common practice in the contemporary art world now to think about monochromatic canvases and monochromatic scenes. So we would have to think a little bit about kind of what could that look like, so that it would be a show that would invite a certain type of engagement with the canvas surface in the way that that Whistler provided. But as you mentioned, Jorge, I think getting up close to painting, looking at impasto, looking at brushwork, looking at texture, like there are the paintings that invite that are really quite compelling in person. And there are a number of artists, contemporary artists, that are working in that way, in Maine particularly.
So then Mabel Gerquist asks, what are plans for the Children's Museum edition? Is there actually going to be a Children's Museum edition?
So the Children's Museum. Okay, I thought the question was about the new Children's Museum that opened. No, so the property, the 142 Free Street property, which is adjoining to the PMA, was purchased by the Portland Museum of Art. And so that property, because of the way that it's set up and kind of the infrastructure, is not really designed at this time to hold collections. You might be familiar, Jorge, with kind of all the climate control and the HVAC systems and everything that those buildings require. So we're in a kind of exploratory space. What's wonderful is that it will give us space to think about how to extend our programming into the community, and how to think about how we can make that area be and feel like one that is shared by lots of folks, that it's not a kind of just an extension in some way. So we're in the thinking space of kind of how do we integrate that into our programming, but because of the infrastructure challenges, we can't use it as an exhibition space in the way that our current building is an exhibition space.
Actually, that brings to mind one of the points that was in that series of the New York Times on museums, and there was this kind of expansion mode that museums were in, getting these architects to create new additions to the museums and expand their space and everything. And one of the points I remember, it was an article that said 10 ways museums can thrive in the future, is to not actually emphasize that so much, that the collections will survive. It's more about circulating the existing collections, which relates to something someone here has asked. Evidently, her family's donated maritime paintings to the museum, and she's asking, what can you do to better share some of the items in the basement, which were donated for posterity, but should be shared with the new public in some way?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question, and I think most museums, all museums really have the majority of their collection in storage. And I think that is just simply by virtue of the fact that, the PMA has 20,000 objects now in its collection. And that's small compared to when you get to kind of the Met or some of these larger museums in which, and then you have a tiny fraction of those objects on view. But the really wonderful thing about that is that museums have really created spaces for these works to be shown on a rotating basis. So I think, thinking about how we reinstall our galleries to be able to bring up works of art that maybe haven't gotten as much view as others in our collection, but also study rooms have been a really interesting development in museums, I would say, within the last 20 years. So the PMA has an art study room that was closed during the pandemic, and we're looking at a timeline now to reopen it. But that's a room where any member of the public can come in and with an advance notice can request to see anything from storage. And that's a really exciting thing to be able to offer the public, because it means that if you're interested in any object that isn't on view, you can reach out to the museum, the curatorial team in advance, and we will work to make that object available to you.
Great. So there's another question here that we've sort of addressed in speaking about this North Atlantic exhibition, but it is, I'm a PMA member, friends outside Maine don't know the Maine museums. What is being done to make Maine's wealth of art more known? So, and that's Betty Kane, and I would like to just add to that, the Maine art that is known largely is very limited, right? People think of seascapes and all, and there is such a wealth of art, that very different kinds of art, right? So I'm interested in whether the museum wants to kind of help change the view of what Maine art really is in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and it's one that I think gets to this kind of the geographical location of Maine, right, in our country, in that in some ways it seems difficult to access, not a place that maybe you would kind of stumble across, and so by virtue of that, perhaps our collections and our museums are less known. But I would actually say that for folks that are interested in American art, for folks that are interested in contemporary art, Maine is known as a place where art has been made for hundreds of years. Art continues to be made, and there are particular programs that really kind of really help foster Maine in that way. If you think about Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, that happens annually in Central Maine. It really brings a vibrant community of contemporary artists from across the world to Maine in a way that they work with each other, but that they also interact and engage with folks elsewhere, kind of around Skowhegan. So it's a really interesting kind of question, because I think there are some folks for whom maybe this seems a little Maine. Well, I don't really know it, and as someone who I'd never been to Maine until I came here for Colby. It was also outside of kind of my realm of experience. But I think folks who are open to the experience and who are looking to be, a little more exposed, I think once you're here, you're hooked, and you start to realize kind of just how how much art there is in this state, how central it is to the history of this state, and really how contemporary artists make it so dynamic and so vibrant of a state.
Hey, this is a related question, actually, from an anonymous attendee. The state of Maine has been a place where artists have come to work for centuries. I would love to see a huge show of work that shows all of the artists that have worked here, and in doing so, show just how important Maine is to the world of art and artists. Any interest?
So that would be a that would be a really large show. But I think there have been shows in the past that have looked at Maine and thought about kind of Maine's role in the history of American art. Most recently, Marsden Hartley's Maine. Some of you might remember that show. So I think we will probably start to see exhibitions that focus on how this state and how this area has been kind of core and central to the career of some artists. But I think we also need to push ourselves a little bit and think about, what does it mean to look outward? What does it mean to think about Maine artists in New York, or Maine artists in the West Coast, or Maine artists in Iceland? How do we think about kind of the Maine artists working in Maine are not only kind of defined by their experiences in Maine, right? We all kind of share and come with all different kinds of life experiences. So how do we tell that story as well? How do we kind of bridge out from our state?
Right, it's not a hermetic environment, right? It's very influenced by everybody. I mean, Joseph Albers came to Skowhegan and people like that. I mean, it's huge.
Yep.
So there's a question here from Elaine Mercier. Will you be considering bringing back 2 programs, Mindfulness in the Galleries and Slow Art Sessions? Both were well done.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that question is a really wonderful and timely and important question, because I think it really points to the ways that museums can provide something that can be hard to find in other areas, right? So thinking about slowing down, thinking about mindfulness, and the ways that we've come to understand all of that as wellness, right? The kind of opportunity to focus on your complete self and not always kind of be running in the rat race of kind of your to-do list or things where you're supposed to be at a particular moment. Museums are a place that force you to slow down. And that is something that is valuable. That is something that is appreciated. And so thank you for that question. I think we will try to find some forum in which we can bring those things back again post-pandemic, or thinking about kind of a space where people can safely engage in those activities in person. We've moved some of that online, slow art in particular. And again, I think thinking about how you immerse yourself in this very deliberate way, even in an online format, can be so valuable. And we've heard so many wonderful and positive things about it from our community members. But I agree that the opportunities to do that in a museum, it's one of the most valuable things about entering a museum physically, is being able to engage in that slow, deliberate way.
Great, thank you. I have more questions. I just want to check with Strawberry to make sure we're okay on time, or how are you doing, Strawberry?
Oh no, I think we can take a few more.
Okay, great. So there's a question here from Tracy Bain Chase. Outside of its beautiful beaches, the Caribbean is one of the most complex regions in terms of diversity and its perpetual search for national and personal identity. The region has been addressing these important topics for over 400 years. Each island has different socio-historical influences and has interpreted them in different ways. Have you considered looking at this region for its history, its ongoing search for identity, and the lessons that have been learned that can be factored into current topics?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the ways that when I refer to kind of broadening our presentation or our understanding of American art, thinking about America as not something that is limited by the 48 states, but is something that engages, particularly in a maritime way with islands, is something that we're absolutely going to continue thinking about. So the museum did do an exhibition of contemporary art from the Caribbean region a few years ago, and I think that was one that really got people thinking and kind of excited about how you can think about these maritime connections and thinking about water, and looking at that as a vehicle for the kind of transition for certain types of aesthetic practices. So yes, the answer to that question is the Caribbean is definitely part of our thinking, part of our understanding of one of the ways we're going to expand out this story.
Great, great. I have another question from John Shipman, actually, which I found interesting. I am new to Portland in today's environment, biological, atmospherically, and socially. Do Maine's native people's perspective help us put our current time in perspective through art and oral history? You addressed some of that before, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and one that I think will be probably one of the most visible ways that the PMA will really expand out in the coming months and in the coming years. You know, we are so fortunate to live in a state that has an artistic history that I would argue is not a couple of hundred years old, but is thousands of years old, right? And thinking about the way that Wabanaki artists and their practices and their relationships to the natural environment are now something that we are thinking about and valuing and understanding, or trying to, and integrating that into our climate policies. You know, it's a really unique and valuable and special time, but it's one in which I think we also have to own publicly really the absence of attention, right? The kind of marginalizing of Wabanaki histories and stories, right? So how do we both do the restorative and repair work to build trust back in relationships, and then also share stories and share narratives with our publics in ways that might be painful to some members of communities, right? So I think that it's a really challenging task, but it's one that is essential for museums to play, because we are one of the few places where you can have this kind of cultural dialogue. But it's not easy, but I think the time is right. I think we're there.
You can have the cultural dialogue specifically in a non-confrontational way, right? It's not that's great.
I think that's the hope. And I think for people who are interested in art, for art lovers, for artists, we recognize the way that art can bridge and reach to folks in ways that maybe words can't.
Right. Well, so many of the questions here, if you're at a loss for curatorial subjects, you can definitely visit the Q&A here, because many people are coming up with very interesting suggestions for shows. So here's another. Two memorable exhibitions at a similarly sized museum, South Australia in Adelaide, were one, works depicting a common theme, for example, love, death, family, loneliness, that covered all time periods in media, from early Indigenous works, classical pieces, and contemporary. And the other exhibition was showing visitors' favorites, which reflected the wide range of pieces, styles, etc. Any interest in doing something along those lines at the PMA using its rich collection?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Also, because the visitor favorites or staff favorites in general tend to be just fantastically interesting shows. I don't know about you, Jorge, but whenever I walk into a bookstore, I immediately beeline for the staff favorites section, because it's always so interesting to understand what are people who are surrounded by books every day, what are they reading? And I think staff favorites or visitor favorites in a museum has a similar kind of capacity. But I love the question about the kind of thematic origin in which you're not kind of putting a boundary around kind of national identity or national origin or time period, right? So you're thinking about land, or you're thinking about interiority, domesticity, what does that look like as an exhibition that is historical, that is contemporary, that is bringing in kind of a kind of range of cultural voices? And how do you create a space for those works of art to be able to speak to each other equitably, right? I think that's really exciting. I would love to say yes
Sounds great. It sounds great.
to doing an exhibition like that. And I think it's wonderful that I think members of our communities and our visitors are excited to see shows like that, right? It really speaks to kind of the expansive approach, not just I think where the PMA's programs are going, but also what our visitors want and what they're seeking to experience when they go into a museum.
Great. So we're right up on our 8 o'clock hour. I just want to thank you so much for being on the Maine Voices with us. You're terrific. You're a really interesting conversation. And I wish you luck in your endeavors there. See if there's anything else. Yeah, no, lots of good comments.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation and the opportunity to kind of think broadly with you.
Great. Thank you.